Leo asked me to have a talk with you guys, and you'll join me on that. I don't know.
Yeah. Do you want to do it after your lecture?
What do you think is best?
Maybe after.
After.
Maybe after? Okay. Okay. So, now I'm going to talk about stuff, another line of my work, which is very, very different from anything having to do with collective behavior or complex fluids or this kind of thing. In fact, this is more, this is almost entirely in collaboration with Jun Zong, who's an experimentalist at NYU, with whom I run the applied math lab. So we actually have an experimental lab, fluid mechanics lab, that Jun and I are the co-directors of, and Jun is a very fine and creative experimentalist. So come to NYU sometime, you should drop by and take a look at the lab. And so, but what I'm going to talk about are some problems in fluid structure interactions that are, now we're not dealing with swimming microorganisms or bacteria or anything like that. We're really going to be talking about cases where inertia is important to the flow. So not all high Reynolds number stuff. We'll be exploring some transitions as you go from low to high Reynolds numbers as well. But really, these are problems that are coming out of experiments that are motivated by kind of biophysical observations of things like flight of birds and flapping of flags and the relation of things like the flapping of flag made to the swimming of the fish. And then on the other side, these are two of my former graduate students, Silas Alden and Saverio Spagnole, with whom I've done a lot of modeling work on these kinds of things. Okay. So now some of these slides I stole from Jun, which means that they have these embedded special effects things that he loves to do, but I don't know how to get rid of them. I really things flying in and out and stuff like that. So, but I'm going to start. The whole talk is going to be about flapping, really. So it's either going to be, structures that are flapping in some fashion or another because they have intrinsic interactions with a fluid that's going by them, or I have some object which is actively flapping and somehow it's transducing that flapping into locomotion. Now, the main thing I just want to say at first is that there's this beautiful woodcut, of course, very famous, and now of course I've forgotten who did it. Who's this guy? Escher, thank you. Very embarrassing, pretty Escher. When I was an undergrad here, in the late 70s, we all had Escher prints, up on our dorm room wall, and then we were not quite a completely lucid state, we would stare dreamily at it. But there's this woodcut showing the transition from a flapping bird to a swimming fish. And the thing that's interesting about that is actually that the birds and fish do share the same type of mechanisms for locomotion, particularly when a fish, for example, is using his pectoral fins to get around, which is really like a pair of wings. But also when you're looking at the structures that get produced behind a fish as it's flapping its tail. Now, Lisa, you just saw in these simulations of lampreys, as they're swimming along, they're really getting thrust out of two things. One just has to do with the motion of this planar body weight pushing fluid back. But they also have timed the shedding of vortices off of their tails so that they produce a so-called reverse von Karman wake. And so here's the classical von Karman wake, say behind a fixed object, and it's a drag wake. And if you look at the way it's being held actually against kind of a momentum arrow that's associated with the wake, which is moving towards it. Okay, so there's a drag associated with that. Fish, on the other hand, produce a similar wake, but the circulation of the top and the bottom vortices are reversed. And so what that means is there's actually a jet of fluid that's kind of meandering through these vortices, and there's no momentum associated with that jet, pointed away from the body. And since the body is free then, it picks up the momentum that comes from that so-called thrust. So this you will see behind swimming fish. You'll see it in the vortical structures that are left behind by flapping birds. Is very, very typical. So kind of a high Reynolds number when you're high enough that you can thrust vortices into the fluid. You can shed them into the fluid, and if you time it right, you can turn that into a thrust, or some part of your thrust. So this is a PIV image behind a swimming mullet. A mullet is not just a bad haircut. So, and here what you're seeing is that behind this swimming fish, again, there's this nice thrust weight, the reverse von Karman weight being left behind as it's swimming. Now here's June again. You know, I just don't know how to get rid of it.
It's not so bad.
It's not so
You
bad.
know, as long as your letters aren't coming out one at a
Yeah,
time.
that's right. Okay, so these are problems, you know, in the class of problems that you call fluid structure interactions. And fluid structure interactions has a very, very long history. And of course, the swimming of fish and flapping of flags and so forth are two kind of canonical problems in there. And what I'm going to talk about first is the flapping of flags, because if you want to think of a fish as a heavy, it's an activated object, but it also has its own elasticity, which can actually modulate itself through the use of its muscles. But it's a heavy elastic sheet or object that's sitting in the fluid, and so it's interesting to think about the simpler case of having a dead fish, right? So that's a flag. A dead fish is just something that's being held, it's got mass, it has inertia, maybe it has rigidity, and you just want to know what are its intrinsic dynamics as it's being held in this fluid. It's not swimming. And so first I'm going to talk about flags, and there's some very interesting history on flags. And so, how many people have heard of the Buddhist philosopher Navier? Almost entirely Chinese, I believe. Every Chinese school kid that I understand learns this story, and I think it's an interesting story. So here he is. He was an itinerant philosopher, just kind of wandering around. And actually, if you go on the web, you can find pictures of his mummified corpse, and which is apparently still preserved in a monastery somewhere in China. And I was going to use that picture in a talk, because on the next slide I had a picture of Lord Rayleigh. But June told me that wasn't very polite. So instead I found this drawing, this beautiful drawing on the web of Hui Yang. So at any rate, he's wandering around, and there he is seated right there. He's the master, very, very famous philosopher. And he's listening to an argument by two young monks. And they're arguing about what's going on with this pennant, which is at the end of a pole, is fluttering in the wind. And one of the monks says, you know, that pennant, you know, is being moved by the wind. You know, kind of like there's structures in the wind, and the pennant is reflecting those structures as it's going by. The other says, no, it's not moving with the wind. The pennant and the wind are moving together. So you know, like they're interacting. It's some sort of coupled system. Whatever it is we're seeing is because they're both talking to each other. Of course, the first has been kind of a classical picture of how a flag flaps, because you have vortices that are being shed off of the flagpole, you think, and the passage of those vortices are being recorded in the deformations of the waves of this flag. And the second is maybe more the kind of integrated view that we take, where fluids and structures are really part of the same system, both communicate forces to the other, both have inertia, both have their various mechanical responses, and whatever comes out, comes out. Anyway, the great master sits there, he's listening to the whole thing, and he interrupts the argument, and he says, obviously paraphrasing, he says, you know, this is all very interesting. You always have to make people feel good. This is all very interesting, but you're both wrong. It's neither the flag moving with the wind or the flag and the wind moving together. It is your mind that moves. Now, he being such an influential guy, this stopped the study of flags for centuries. It was revisited by Lord Rayleigh in the 1800s, who considered flags as a case of a special case of having a zero mean circulation vortex sheet. Okay, so just some sort of slip surface in the flow without any special internal mechanics, where, you know, if I take a little piece of it, some part would be rotating like this, and the other part would be rotating like this, and that would have an instability that would lead to a linearly growing wake structure, a very weak instability with a linear in time growth, T, not E to the T. And now, and so that led to this kind of picture in the kind of popular science imagination that flags were always unstable, because in this case, is, you know, for any wavelength, you have no regularization, you have no vorticity, you have no internal mechanics. You can imagine that if the flag had some rigidity, that might damp out some instabilities and so forth. So, but it kind of led to the idea that flags would always be unstable. And this is something that we revisited in the lab now over a decade ago, but let me tell you about that. This was a beautiful experiment. And this is June's baby. And so, I think what got this particular experiment so much press and led to a lot of subsequent work in other groups is the fact that it was just so visually beautiful. So what this is the flapping of a flag in a soap film, which is only about 2 to 4 microns thick. Okay? So the experimental device actually is a soap film frame is about this high. That's the test section is about that high. There's a reservoir of soapy solution, 2% Dawn or something like that. Now they've changed the formula, so we actually had to go find another soap-ish detergent to flags in. But, and so...
Did they say that they changed new improved Dawn, or did you just figure it out that it didn't work?
It didn't work. Yeah, in fact, you know, some other things happened too. You had to start adding salts and all sorts of things. It was a little more complicated. So, so what you're seeing here is about a 3.5 or 2 centimeter length of silk thread that's been wetted into the plane of the soap film and is just being held in it, and the fluid is running down, gravity fed from this reservoir, running down between these 2 pieces of fishing line. And it's actually flapping here, and here it's not flapping, and you can see it's shedding a nice narrow von Karman wake, and here it is flapping, and it's shedding something much bigger. And let me show you a movie of this. Yes, enable all content. Thank you. And so this is from 2000. And there it is. And so you see this beautiful vortical wake. Again, this is essentially, because the flag is changing the sign of the circulation of the very sharp shear layer that's shedding at each stroke. What's being left behind here is indeed basically a 0 circulation strength vortex sheet, which is unstable locally to a Kelvin-Helmholtz instability, and so then it's constantly rolling up, and you're left with all these nice tight vertical structures behind it. So, and you do see more or less a linear growth in this. So it's really the wake that is I think well described by Rayleigh's original analysis. So
Is it self-generating?
well, we're gonna get to that. Now, what we find, what June found in particular, is that this, no, let me just say one other thing. There's no flagpole in this experiment. Okay? This thing is glued onto the end of this little post, which is not much bigger than the flag itself. You don't see anything in here that looks like big vortices that are rolling down the flag. There's some little tiny things there. You certainly don't you don't see any vortices kind of on the scale of these waves. So it turns out that there's an intrinsic instability of the interaction with this heavy elastic object with the flow, which has nothing to do with the flagpole sitting up in front of it. And in fact, what you find is that if you use length, so you feed the flag out of this little tube into the soap film, so you can change the length as a control parameter. That as you change the length, you will have this kind of straight case be nice and stable. Again, kind of in contravention to the popular interpretation of Rayleigh's model. Straight can be stable, but then at some point, at some length, it leaps up, and then it starts flapping, and then it actually shows the hysteretic behavior as you try to pull the string back into the tube. So it seems to have an intrinsic instability, and has stability, and hysteresis. Okay. So, that's nice. You move for me? Let's do it this, oops, this working. There we go. Okay, so there were, and in the past decade, this subfilm frame has become kind of one of the experimental devices in the lab that just keeps giving. So there's been a lot of different experiments running into various sorts of interactions of bodies with subfilm flows. The interesting thing about subfilm flows is that you can, to a close approximation, they really do behave like two-dimensional Navier-Stokes flows. Okay, and the in-plane viscosity, viscous resistance to motion, in this particular case gives you a Reynolds number of somewhere around, I think, 10,000. Okay, so it's a high Reynolds number flow. And so you can look at other things. So in that same paper, then, these are just some observations of what happens when you take two flags. You start to look at body-body coupling through the fluid. So you're looking at two flags that are held in parallel to each other, and then what happens is a function of the separation distance between them. And so if they're far enough apart, then they're kind of, or I guess that's actually closer, sorry. If they're close, then they lock in phase, and you just have in-phase traveling waves moving down. As you move them further apart, then you move into another mode where you're kind of doing this slapping fluid out and shooting out kind of little vortex dipole each time, which you can see. And if you move them even further apart, you can start moving into more decoupled dynamics. And in that same, so we put in things like closed loops. We looked at things like drag reduction, when you put an elastic fiber that's transverse to the flow, and look at how drag reduces because the body will bend itself. You end up getting new drag laws, other things like that. So we were thinking about models of how tree leaves will roll themselves up into tight cones that get tighter with wind speed to reduce the growth of drag with wind speed. So we looked at things like this as well. And more recently, June has been using this to look at interactions between flexible bodies that are arrayed in schools in various ways, and has found some interesting effects that you call anomalous drafting. And so now, you know, if you're off in a pack of bicycles, it's nice to be right behind somebody. Actually, I'm a very avid long-distance rollerblader. I do a lot of inline skating. And I love getting up behind a bicyclist because it relieves a lot of the wind drag because you're riding right behind them, and it also drives them crazy. I really hate having a skater right behind me. So it's got various pleasures that are associated with it, but that's the classic version of drafting. What's that?
Can you really keep up with a bike?
You know, I'm pretty fast, but a bicyclist is really fast. So you know, you need to find somebody that is not maybe the most fit person. But what one of the things that June found is that if you look at drafting with flexible objects, then it turns out you can reverse that whole classical result. And what happens is that it's actually the person, or the flapper, at least with her he and she, lampreys. So it's actually the flapper that's up front that has the reduced drag, and it's the object that's following that has somewhat slightly increased drag. But you can massively reduce the drag of the leader. And so there's a very nice PRL that he and Mike Risroff have. Mike was at the time a Cornell graduate student working on fly locomotion in the lab at Cornell, and now he's a postdoc with us, looking at some collective behavior problems. But you might take a look at that because it's very, very pretty stuff. And these subfoam frames, if you have a lab, they're pretty easy to build. It's a nice setup. Okay, so this led to a lot of work, not only by our own group, but by many people, particularly in the United States and France. And we had, as I said the other day, we have an annual reviews in fluid mechanics article that came out this year on flapping and bending in high-speed flows. And you can see all the things that have been done. It's actually, these experiments have driven the development of a lot of numerical work, adaptations to look at things like interactions of flexible bodies or heavy bodies with fluids, adaptations in the immersed boundary method by Charlie Peskin's group, some work of my own that I'll talk about in a second, as well as a lot of adaptive grid methods for the Navier-Stokes equations, where you're resolving adaptively areas around a moving flexible body, and then you couple it to an narrow flow. So, lots of different things. So, let me tell you about one hydrodynamical model that is really based on Rayleigh's original conception of a flag as a slip surface in a flow. And this is work of mine with Cyrus Holden. And so we'll use it just to build a simple model for the instability of the flag, but also to build a nonlinear model for the fully non-local coupled dynamics of the flag. And this is really based on the dynamics of a vortex sheet. So in that first week, did anybody ever talk about vortex sheets? Okay. Talk about the Biot-Savart law and vorticity dynamics? Okay. These guys. Okay.
Maybe they just forgot.
They talked about Biot-Savart.
Okay. So Biot-Savart, if I have an incompressible Newtonian fluid, the Biot-Savart law relates kinematically, it relates the vorticity to the velocity that the vorticity produces, right? So let's something like this. Let's just take 2D. This is true whether you're talking about Euler or Navier-Stokes, but it becomes particularly simple if you're talking about Euler. So it says that the velocity in the fluid you can write as 1 over 2 pi I. So I'm just going to assume I have an open fluid, and I have some distribution of vorticity in the fluid. So here's the vorticity. So in 2D, vorticity is just a scalar field. Right? And using the fact that the velocity field is incompressible, and that I can reconstruct the velocity from the perpendicular gradient of the stream function by solving that Poisson problem, then I can write integral over the plane, a convolution integral, just like that. I can reconstruct the velocity field. Okay, just go into vorticity. Now, in 2D, if I don't have any viscosity, then the vorticity tracks along material lines. Right? And in that case, if you put yourself in the so-called Lagrangian frame, and you identify U with the velocity of Lagrangian points, then I can just turn this into a big set of ordinary differential equations to an integral where I'm just tracking the vorticity, and that's tracking the particle points, which track the vorticity, which track the particle points. I just end up with a closed system. Okay. Now, I don't want to spend the time going through that, but there's something that is called the Lagrangian vorticity formulation. And that's for Euler. And it's just a prescription of how the vorticity moves itself through the fluid. Okay, because vorticity creates a velocity, that moves the material points, but the vorticity tracks the material points. So if you know the material points, then you know the vorticity. You just evaluate Biot-Savart again, and just keep pushing it along. Now, that turns out to be true if I have a slip surface in a 2D Eulerian fluid. Okay, so let's assume that I'm irrotational out here, and I have a slip velocity across some surface. It's like that vortex layer that's being shed off the end of the sheet. I have a very sharp change in velocity, which is mostly tangential to this surface. And then it looks something like this. If I call this point x of alpha t, where alpha is some sort of Lagrangian variable that's tracking along with this, the del x del p of alpha p, I can write as 1 over 2 pi integral, and then there's some strength of the slip, which I'll just write as gamma of alpha prime. And it's really a circulation density or a vorticity density now. I'm thinking the vorticity is now a delta function. So now the vorticity is going to be some sort of delta function. And that's the density. There can be some metrics, geometric metrics that you have to worry about in this, but it's close enough. And then I have x of alpha minus x of alpha prime per. I mean, it's just like that. Turn the sign, turn the order of the x and y and give a minus sign to one of them. So you need a square there. E alpha prime. And so this is a slip surface that propagates itself by knowing the knowledge of the circulation density on the surface. Okay. And this is called the Birkhoff-Rod integral. And this is the kind of model that Rayleigh was thinking about when he thought about flags. He was thinking about slip surfaces that propagate themselves. So we're going to take that kind of picture and we're going to build a model of a flag where we add mechanics to that picture, internal mechanics. So we're going to think of the flag as this object up here in dark. That's the so-called bound vortex sheet. It's not going to be free. We have to determine how the circulation on it evolves. And then I have the free sheet, which is the part that's being shed, where vorticity is just being tracked along in the flow. Okay? And so here's the Biot-Savart integral, actually again, what I just wrote down. And this is a background flow that just says that x hat. I've just normalized the far field velocity to 1 coming from that direction. So that's what the velocity field looks like, induced by this vortex sheet. This is really a special case of the Biot-Savart integral where I have the vorticity as a delta function on a curve. So I have a background flow, background linear flow, constant flow, plus the perturbation that comes from the presence of the sheet. Now, there's a dynamics that goes with this gamma when you're on the bound sheet, because the vorticity that's sitting on the surface is going to arise because I have balance of inertial forces of the sheet. I'm going to let it have mass. It's going to have internal mechanical forces like tensile forces and bending forces, and those all have to balance against the pressure load that comes from the fluid. And so what you do then is you can use the Euler equations matched on either side of the sheet, on this bound sheet, to find an equation for the evolution of the slip, or the vorticity density that's sitting on the surface. And you can see it involves the pressure jump, the derivative of the pressure jump. So this is an advection equation that's driven by the pressure load.
So there's some boundary condition for gamma at the interface between.
Yeah, I wasn't going to go into that, but there's an unsteady cutter condition that tells you how much circulation you're shedding into the fluid because of the passage of the fluid over the sheet. It's complicated. Okay, now what specifies the jump of the pressure? Well, that shows up in the F equals ma balance for the bound vortex sheet as a mechanical object. So here's the bound sheet. Now, in the free sheet, the jump of the pressure is 0. Okay? So then you just have this advection equation for the vortex sheet surface. So then what you have, I've now put things in scaled units. I have some dimensionless parameters because I set that far field velocity to 1, things like that. I have a length of the sheet, I scale on that. So what I have then, thinking of the internal mechanics of the sheet, what drives it? It has inertia. So there's that. I allow it to have tensile forces because I'm going to assume that this is an inextensible object. So if the flow stretches it or compresses it, I have to develop a tension that compensates for that exactly. So I have to, that's really the Lagrange multiplier of the whole problem. That's a bending force. Okay, so that's Euler-Bernoulli elasticity, right there, or a nonlinear elastica. And then the pressure load acts as a normal stress across the surface, and that's just the normal excess curve. So that's it. There's two dimensionless parameters. One is a dimensionless mass, which is the mass of the flag, so the mass of fluid displaced over in the area of the length of the flag. And the other is a dimensionless elastic energy. So here that's the bending rigidity divided by length, so this is elastic energy, and then this is the kinetic energy of the fluid flowing around in the area of the flag. Okay, so you can do a simple linear theory on this. You can throw away the weight and just say, I'm going to look at biperiodic flags. Look at the instability of a biperiodic flag. So you look for, and you can linearize this thing, and what you can show is that for small vertical displacements, you end up getting an integral equation that looks like that. So that's the acceleration piece again, with some translation in it. And this comes from that Biot-Savart integral. The linearization of the Biot-Savart integral linearizes into something called Hilbert transform. Hilbert transforms are very, very important in incompressible flows. They show up all over the place. They show up in construction of nice numerical methods for handling geometric stability constraints. Anyways, it's this kind of thing. So a linearized Biot-Savart law. And it's a nice linear singular operator, and you can find how it behaves under a Fourier transform. And you can look for eigenvalues in this thing. So you can find a dispersion relation. So I'll just put it there. I just want to say what are some of the properties of this system and some of the predictions it makes, because it's interesting. If I have no rigidity, here's my dimensionless rigidity. If I have no rigidity, then this predicts that the flag is unstable at all length scales. Okay? So if I have no rigidity, then indeed I'm just unstable, and it's driven by the mass interacting with the. It's not this kind of linear growth that in time growth that Rayleigh found. It's an exponential growth. It comes from the mass pushing on the fluid. On the other hand, if I have no mass and I have rigidity, then I have only dispersive waves. Okay, and so you're always neutrally stable. And so the upshot of it is that you really need mass, this predicts, in order to have instability, an intrinsic instability of the flag. And this is something that I found through this analysis, and Charlie Peskin and his student found through simulations of the flag with the inverse boundary method, where they started with the massless flag and they just an elastic sheet, and they couldn't get it to flap until they added mass. So that's an interesting thing. You don't have these strong instabilities unless you have a heavy enough flag. And June went back and made a heavier flag and found it would have transitions to instability more rapidly than the ones that were lighter. So it was consistent with what was being found in the experiment. Okay, so what we also got from our analysis is that if you want to make a flag flap in water, you need to be damn heavy. Because water has a lot of inertia that the inertia of the flag has to act against. And so we had a nice little paper a few years after that, where in order to make a flag flap in water, we had to make it out of brass plates. And so they were brass plates that were put on a mylar substrate that gave it flexibility. So you can see it, they're just kind of glued onto a piece of mylar, and then these little joints that are just the mylar gives it like a hinge effect. And let me show you just a little picture, a little movie of that. It's just like a fish. This is now a water tunnel in the lab. There's a flapping metal flag in a water flow. And so, very recently, some people we know at Brooklyn Poly reconstructed this experiment and put it on top of a kind of a piezoelectric polymer material that if you flexed it, it would then generate a current. And so they have an interesting little paper where they reconstruct this on top of not mylar, but a different type of flexible material, and they use it to do energy harvesting from the interaction of this flag being held against the flowing stream. And this is some flow visualization from their experiment, actually. I just found it today. I found it this morning during Lisa's talk when she was saying, Mike, what do you do this week? I said, oh, energy harvesting. So, but here's a kind of a dye visualization of the dynamics of your flag, but at the same time, this is generating a current that you might use to charge some device like an underwater sound wave or something like that. These kind of chips. Okay, then Silas and I took this and instantiated the fully nonlinear model, which, as Lisa said, you need to have a boundary condition for how you shed vorticity off of the bound sheet into the free sheet. You need to decide how you're going to handle the leading edge. It's actually very complicated because the flag problem there becomes a nonlinear Hilbert transform problem, and you have to use special. You don't have to, but it's efficacious to use special kind of orthogonal polynomial decompositions on the flag to represent it. It's all kind of fancy. But you can find a lot of that described in some of the subsequent papers of Silas's in the Journal of Computational Physics. But here's from a simulation showing a sheet, a vortex sheet that's being shed in a simulation from a bound sheet. So this is from a PRL was 2 or 3 years ago. So there's the wake structure behind it. And let me just show you some movies of simulations from this, where what we're doing is we're fixing the mass of the flag, and we're just decreasing its rigidity. Because as fixed mass, we're just making it less and less rigid. And you can find, we get some very sharp and interesting transitions in behavior as you do that. So there is a flag which is somewhat more rigid. I think that's the same simulations I showed you on the previous slide, where we have this nice vortex sheet. It looks a lot like the experiments, of course. Otherwise, I wouldn't be showing it to you.
So the dotted lines, you're solving for the Lagrangian norm of x of s and t that are on the unbound sheet.
On the unbound sheet, yeah. They're just being vected with the flow. Well, let me just say, this is a version of what you call a boundary interval method. Okay? So I have a fluid flow that is two-dimensional, but because the flow off of certain surfaces are divergence-free and curl-free, this means I'm really solving in the bulk for some velocity potential, so I just have some sort of linear PDE that I'm solving. And so I can represent solutions to that in terms of integrals on boundaries where the boundary data sits. And that's very much in the flavor of the regularized Stokes stuff that Lisa was talking about last time, where you're posing everything onto the boundaries. And so you're reducing the cost from being that of solving a 2 or 3-dimensional fluid flow problem to just evolving stuff that's on the boundaries. Now, the cost that you pay for that is that you end up typically, because the Green's functions for linear differential operators generically have singularities, the cost you pay for that is you have singular integral equations that sit on surfaces. You have to either figure out how to evaluate those in some accurate fashion, or you have to figure out how to regularize them in some accurate fashion. So you have to deal with that problem. But the savings is big, because you put everything onto the boundary. Now, not only do you put everything onto the boundary, but since they devolved from something like, a linear constant coefficient partial differential equation like Stokes or like Laplacian, that means you get to use all these fancy modern methods like fast multipole or tree methods or things like that that will reduce interaction costs of O of n log n, or even O of n. Okay, so there can be big savings, both in terms of reduction of dimension and in having very, very efficient methods. Okay, now, so you saw that. Now we reduce the rigidity a little bit. And what you find, if you look at the temporal spectrum associated with this dynamics, is that you start to see the emergence of higher harmonics. So it starts to become both a spatially and a temporally more complicated dynamics, because I'm starting to be able to allow more degrees of freedom in the dynamics of this little bound flag. It's floppier, it's more loose. And then if you push that down a little bit more.
Or the little plus sign.
Oh, okay. So you're shedding this wake away from the sheet. At some point, just so we don't have to absorb the cost of doing the interactions, we absorb it into an effective vortex. We grab a bunch of them and we give the vortex in their center of mass with the same circulation. So you just see it collapse under those pluses. They're far enough away that it doesn't affect much the dynamics of the body. And here is one where we've reduced it yet further. And there you see you get this very complicated, messy wake that comes out, and an associated very complicated, messy dynamics that fly. And I forgot to put the figure on here, but June went back and again played with the problem, so I forgot whether we had either higher velocity or less rigidity. They're dimensionally kind of the same thing, combination of dimensionless coefficients. And was able to see things like that in the experiments. Which is not so surprising. You get this transition to kind of very chaotic behavior. Yes?
Did
Do you see something similar if you, because this is in a steady flow, right?
Yes.
So if you change the velocity of the flow, but you don't change the rigidity, so if you increase the Reynolds number.
Oh, so these are all infinite Reynolds numbers.
Oh, okay.
Because I'm dealing with Euler. Oh yeah, I should have said that.
Okay.
So here's what's going on. Now, if I have a flow with boundaries in it, right, then, and I'm looking at Navier-Stokes, then I have a singular limit to the Euler equations where I have to account for a boundary layer, very thin boundary layer that is going to be shedding off into the fluid. So this is a model then for the shedding of a boundary layer into a fluid by accounting for having this kind of cutter condition that lets you shed a vortex sheet off into the fluid. So it's a model for how a boundary layer is shed, actually a bilayer. Two boundary layers are shed into a fluid whose bulk circulation is what we're shedding here. So this is it's kind of an interesting thing. If you look at, for example, a flat plate being held in a fluid where you have the streamlines be symmetric on either side, and that has zero drag. But Helmholtz has this very famous problem where what he does is he allows for wake structure by self-consistently solving for a vortex sheet that's being shed off of either end, and then you have a stagnant region behind it at zero pressure and zero velocity. And then it turns out as soon as you do that, then you have a drag. So the shedding of vorticity is associated with the production of drag. And this is a model for that in the infinite Reynolds number. Yeah, so circulation only gets created, or vorticity only gets created by viscosity. But we have a model for it using it from infinite Reynolds in some cases. Okay, so what we found out of this, as I said, you end up having creation of subharmonics as you're moving down in rigidity, and then you can go to a very chaotic vector spectrum. You can match with various models. That model that I first showed you, so we can use the numerics to find transition boundaries in S1 and S2 between being stable and neutrally stable and unstable. And we can match with various theories, Argentina, Mahadevan, my own, and then work by a French group more recently. And you can see our theory actually does a pretty good job over a good range of capturing that stability. You see what one does particularly well, especially at the high masses. Yeah.
So this transition between the stable and unstable, it's purely dimensionless thing. You have the S1 and S2. Has anyone tested that experimentally by varying like the length, the mass, the density?
Yes. Yeah. In fact, one of those that what I showed you was I suppressed one slide, but you find if you either sweep forward in velocity or you sweep forward in length. So length in the case of the subfilm and velocity in the case of the metal slag in water, you get these sharp transitions, both of which are qualitatively in line with our stability analysis. Okay, so now so there's that. It's all kind of a nice story. But let me get back to talking about locomotion. But I should say that this machinery of looking at vortex sheets and flows as models for high Reynolds numbers is a very nice thing to work with. It's kind of technologically difficult. You have to develop a lot of methods. But Silas and others have kind of taken this on since and have looked at various things like how would you produce a thrust if you actually took your flag and you started to drive it somehow. So you now have some sort of flapping frequency. You have an interaction between the object behind you and the flow. Okay, and so then you can start having things that look more like thrusts rather than zigzags. So you can find that in that kind of detail. But let me talk about another kind of flapping, a related kind of flapping again, and another set of experiments and theory that came out of our lab. And this has to do with the following observation, and it was really made by Steve Childress, who is another close colleague of mine at Courant. And how many of you have the Mechanics of Swimming and Flying by Steve Childress? One of the classics of biological fluid mechanics. So, as you have heard many, many times, there's this, stupid scallop theorem, right, that says you have to have some sort of non-reversible motion in order to transport yourself in a low Reynolds number fluid. So, there we are, there's a bacterium in its flagellar bundle that's propagating the way backwards so it can move itself forward. And then, of course, very interestingly, at high Reynolds number, we can have motions that are essentially reciprocal, but nonetheless lead to translation. And that's what I'm implying. Now, of course, what I'm about to talk about is a flying object which has no broken symmetry, unlike this bird. It can run forward when it takes off. It's got a different shape fore and aft. Its wings are not symmetrical of this. But I'm going to see how much you can get out of flapping for just a completely, if you like, a featureless wing that doesn't know about direction. Now, the interesting thing too, though, is that there are organisms, so this is high Reynolds number here, this is low Reynolds number here, and there are organisms that live between these worlds that show both types of locomotion strategies. And so this is a small mollusk, I think it's a couple of centimeters at this point, it's called Cleona antarctica. It lives in the Antarctic Ocean. And Steve and his biologist friend Robert Dudley got an SF to send him down to Antarctica to study Cleona antarctica. And now the thing that's interesting about Cleona antarctica is that when they're very young, they have ciliary bands around them, and so they get around by ciliary motion from the power and recovery stroke. A bunch of cilia. You'll see that in a second. But when they get older, they unflap a set of wings and they start to flap, and they start to locomote around by flapping. Now, let's see. So here's a movie they took. Right? What's going on? Let me start that again. This is really endearing. Looking at this little creature get around. There's Cleona antarctica with a microscope. There's its wings, kind of waddling around the water. And if you look close, you can also see these ciliary, these kind of little hairs sticking out of it. And so it's kind of moving around. I think it's actually doing kind of both. It's using the ciliary bands and it's flapping. So, but this is an organism that, at some point in its life, the kind of recognizes I can use something else to get around, which is presumably more efficient, though that hasn't really been looked at. And so then it starts to flap wings. So this I think is a beautiful thing. And so this led to another set of experiments. But here's the basic question. We're going to be dealing with Navier-Stokes. So of course there's a Reynolds number. And here I have a body, has a length L and a velocity U, viscosity and density and so forth. And the question is there some point in this Reynolds number at which the flow somehow changes in response to the body that allows the body to utilize the flow differently, namely inertia, or vortices start to be shed, or some sort of instability happens, something like that. So this is an experiment from 04, 05, a beautiful little experiment that June and Steve cooked up, and we call it the Rotary Flapper. Okay? And here it is. It's not Cleona antarctica, it's simpler than that, thank God. And so you just take a flat piece of steel, just like that, and you mount it on an axle, which is free to rotate in either direction. And all you're going to do is you're going to move that thing up and down, up and down, up and down, in a tank of water. So, you know the length, you know the span of the wing, you have the frequency times the amplitude of the drive, that lets you define a frequency Reynolds number, a forcing Reynolds number. If you move this slowly, okay, nothing happens. It just sits there in place, moving up and down. So it's like a reciprocal motion that's in a Stokes fluid. And in this case, it doesn't generate any net fluid transport. Okay, so just nice symmetric vortices, kind of some fat vortical structure presumably behind it is this one. But there it is when it's moving slow. But if you move it fast enough, then it turns out that there is an instability And it doesn't like to sit there in place, and it will start to spontaneously spin around in one direction or the other. But once it gets moving, it's very coherent. It just keeps moving around and around and around. That's what's nice about the rotation. You'd like to set up a wing that would translate, but then you can't run it forever because you don't have an infinitely long track. So this is kind of a nice setup where you do it as a rotation instead of translation. And if you look at the wake, so here the wing, June has seeded the fluid with bubbles. This thing is kind of flying past. You're looking at some section through the fluid, a planar section with a light sheet. And you see the vortices that are being shed behind it. It turns out that if you track the velocity field, you have a reversed von Karman street, or if you like birds and fish, you have a thrust wake. So it's leaving behind a thrust wake. Yeah.
Sorry, what's the orientation here? Which direction is it being pulled and which direction is it rotating?
Here's the wing. You're taking a sheet through the reservoir like that, and so it's kind of translating through that sheet, left to right. And these are the vortices being shed behind, they're left behind as it moves. I'll show you a movie right now. And again, the sign of these vortices are displaced up and down is such that you have a meandering jet going through there. So you're imparting inertia into the fluid, momentum into the fluid, and in force balance, that means you have the same momentum of the sheet, or sheet, of the wing moving in the other direction. Of course, there are walls in this too. They can absorb momentum, all that kind of stuff. Not make it complicated. Here's a movie. There it goes flying by. Now, of course, it's circling around this big tank. Here it comes. Flying by. Okay. Now, once you have a speed of rotation, you can define a Reynolds number based on that speed of rotation. And just by convention of his own, June chooses 3/4 of the way down the wing to define where you're going to measure the rotation speed. So this gives you what's called a translational or rotational Reynolds number, which you can plot against the frequency Reynolds number. Okay, so here's what it looks like for one particular experiment being done in water. So there's frequency Reynolds number. It's a little bit like the flag experiment again. You move along and you're just nice and flat. Then you jump up, and then you get into a regime where you're more or less linear in the frequency Reynolds number to the rotational Reynolds number. So the inverse slope of that curve is what's called the Struwel frequency. That's what Lisa was talking about. It's the ratio of the speed of the downward motion to the speed of the object. And so the lower the Struwel number, the more you're getting out of each stroke. Okay, the further you're going on each stroke. And in this case, it's around 0.26.
That's pretty low.
It's pretty low. Now, what's interesting is that there have been some experimental measurements using RoboTuna at MIT, the Fantalu group, and they built a mechanical tuna. They measured, thrust, drag, Struwel numbers, all this kind of stuff. And the interesting thing is that this is in the range of what they call efficient animal swimming. So animals that are highly tuned for efficient locomotion. That's the range of Struwel frequencies that they sit in. And we get in that range by, I should say June in particular, I don't do experiments, but it's the royal rate. Physicists always like to say that. Then we looked at the gamma bay, something. But, so you, just with this very simple mechanical device, where there's a very simple actuation, there's no broken symmetries, just a flat plate, you can get into the same range of Struwel frequencies. And it shows up, apparently, as a symmetry breaking bifurcation, because this will go either way. Now, this thing happens at a big Reynolds number around 400, okay? Yeah.
How much can you change that ratio by changing the definition of the frequency Reynolds number?
Well, you can make it even better by going further out on the wing.
But can you get out of that range? I mean, it's
Yeah. Okay. So the one in the experiment, one complicating feature is that, of course, to allow this pole, this support to rotate, you have to have a bearing. Okay. And so that bearing has a yield stress associated with it, and actually the fluid forces here are quite small. So you can buy very expensive bearings, but nonetheless the yield stress can be enough that you can really knock up, where this transition is going to be. And so then they did a whole set of experiments where they successively thickened the fluid by adding glycerol, so they could systematically remove the effect of the bearing, which was, of course, yield stress is independent of the viscosity of the fluid. And so they were able to extrapolate out that there was some sort of transition somewhere in the range of 20 to 50 in Reynolds number. Now, it's funny about one thing about Reynolds number. So people talk about low Reynolds number, they talk about order 1 Reynolds number, they talk about high Reynolds number. Now, actually this is kind of order 1 Reynolds number. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not really, it's some intermediate order 1 Reynolds number where viscosity and inertia are kind of in some sort of balance.
So it doesn't happen at 1,
It doesn't happen at 1, it happens 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, something like that. And so when you're in the numerics game, high Reynolds number means 1,000 to 10,000. When you're talking with somebody in aircraft design, high Reynolds number means 10 to the 6th. So anyway. So Silas and I decided to look at this numerically. To see, there were some puzzles about the experiment. What was giving rise to the instability? What about, you could see that there was this hysteretic, apparently there was this hysteretic bifurcation, which could have been caused, maybe it's the interaction of the fluid in the wing, as it seemed to be with the flag, but maybe it was coming from something to do with the bearings, the nonlinearity in the bearing. So, plus we wanted to look for the simpler case of translation. So I'll just go quickly through this nice numerical study, and this is due mostly to Silas. So now just a bit of numerics again. So what we did was we did a translational problem, not a rotational problem. Translation's easier. And so we have an elliptical shape, featureless, so up, down, left, right, symmetric, and we build a grid around it. And actually, we built it more or less on a technique that Jane Wang used to look at hovering flight, using elliptical wings when she was a postdoc with BMC at Corona a few years before that. So we hijacked that approach that she had used. So we moved this informally mapped grid onto the body, and we moved the whole grid with the body. So we can put more points near the surface if we like, and have more resolution there, and so forth. And then in this moving frame, you have to write down the right boundary conditions and so forth at the body and at infinity, which we just take some big distance r from the body, some 20 body lengths or so. And we do it all in this so-called Vorticity string formulation of Navier-Stokes. Okay, Saverio came up with some somewhat nicer methods actually than Silas had done. Better ways of treating parts of the dynamics, but in this first version, it's a second order implicit in time method. As Lisa tells you, if you want to, we were talking the other night when she was telling you about implicit time stepping methods, and my own opinion is that if you want to know if somebody's a professional or an amateur in solving partial differential equations in time, it's whether they use implicit time stepping or not. And if they don't, that means, well,
So should I walk out now? Sometimes it's too hard.
sometimes it's too hard because that's what I'm saying.
Sometimes it's too hard.
Lisa's an absolute professional. She's a consummate
Yeah,
professional.
you
But sometimes you just have to do it explicit time.
you have to recognize that.
Yeah, okay. Sometimes the sources of the stiffness are just too nonlinearly embedded in the problem for you to kind of usefully extract out a method. And it's unfortunate, but true. Okay, so we solved the bulk with Navier-Stokes in the moving frame, and then the body dynamics is just given by F equals ma, where we're using the fluid stresses on the body in the horizontal direction to drive the dynamics in the horizontal direction. So it's this balance of momentum in the horizontal direction, not in the vertical, because we are prescribing the displacement up and down. So we have two parameters. We have a frequency Reynolds number, and then we have this dimensionless mass of the body, which is essentially the mass of the body that we have to displace over time. Okay. Now, let me just say that if you do this nice and slowly, you see what you see in the experiment. You just see symmetric vortices being shed up above and below. But what do we know about the motion of bodies through a fluid that's shedding away as you increase the speed of that body? There's an instability, right? It's the von Karman instability. It's a symmetry breaking instability. And so what you find is that there is a frequency at which you start to get instability or asymmetry in the wake response to the motion of the body. And that's the first instability that you see here. And so let me show you a simulation of a body that is density matched to the fluid and at about a frequency Reynolds number of about 35. And I'm suppressing the ones that don't show anything other than symmetry. So there it's got a nice symmetric wake. You start off with about, I think, a 0.5% perturbation in the horizontal momentum, and that's kind of the seeds and dynamics. It looks like it's starting to get around. It's shedding something like a reversed wake. But goes back the other way, back. Failure.
You probably said it, but what are the black lines?
Those are just things that we put into the movie so you can see where it was. Because we're just solving it in some huge disk, so you need to put some sort of visual reference so you can see where it was. Okay. So that's a swimmer maybe, but it's a chaotic swimmer. It doesn't have anywhere in particular to go. It just is moving around. So it turns out that the key to this, again, like the flag, is you need to make it heavier. Right? Then you have a time scale over which you can kind of average the dynamics between this inertial time scale. And so this is the same simulation, and now it's a hell of a lot heavier than the fluid. It's a factor of 30. Now, of course, we're putting all of our mass into the wing, but really the way to think about this is that this is like an appendage, which might be quite light, but it's attached to a big inertial body, like the body of Cleomenes. But we're just putting it all into the cross-section of this wing. Now we do it again. Initially, it looks exactly the same, but you have this asymmetry in the wake that develops because you're losing symmetry as being a stable state. The vortex dipole, vortex dipole, vortex dipole. And it starts to fly. So let me play that again. So it just keeps going. This will just, as long as you want to run your code, it'll just keep going off to the left. And now it's shedding this reverse von Karman street behind it. So, I'm going to point something out. It's moving up and down, it's shedding red here up above, and at some point it's going to couple with the red one that's already shed and produce a dipole with a blue that's being shed below. There it goes. That gives it an impulse. And then somehow that initial impulse just pushes it into the same dynamics and then ends up being in this locomotion. So it was an interaction with the previously shed vortex. After a while, because things were quite messy and chaotic, one just happened to couple with a shed vortex in the right way to produce something that moved momentum away from the body, the vortex type. Okay, and this is the kind of dynamics that you get out of it. There it goes flying away. And there's that initial event where at some point it's coupled with the previous shed vortex to give you this dipole there. So what you're seeing is flapping flight emerging from a symmetry breaking instability in just a simple mechanical system. And this seems to be quite robust, so long as you have enough mass. So there's lots of discussion in the biology literature about the origin of flight. Talk about flying squirrels, was it because animals were dropping down from the trees and gliding, then they developed wings, or reptiles were running along the ground and they started to glide, and then they started to fly. But maybe Cleone Antarctica has a very different evolutionary path where you just have, it's doing flapping flight, it's just not doing it in air, it's doing it in water instead, where it's an organism that has some appendages because it wants to stir up the fluid around it and bring food in its neighborhood. That's successful. So it gets a little bigger over time, appendages get bigger, and then it crosses a transition where suddenly those appendages let it start to move around and start to locomote. And then you have selection come in a big way once you cross that boundary, and you become better and more proficient at it. So no doubt that there are many paths by which flapping flight may have emerged, but maybe there's a very different one, which really came from kind of a low Reynolds number world, and things starting to get a little bit bigger. So, of course, you can't ever prove these things unless you have a whole set of kind of, either in the geologic record fossils, or you have some other set of closely related organisms that are moving along and show other types of characteristics. So, anyway, I think it's thought-provoking. And so we find, again, in this case, a symmetry breaking bifurcation for this particular wing around 10. And actually, down here, there's an earlier symmetry breaking bifurcation that doesn't lead to flight, just kind of a vibratory dynamics where it doesn't really get going until you reach about 10. And then you have this transition region, then you end up with a screw hole of about 0.18. It's quite small. So you're really taking quite a few body lengths per stroke. And so, as I say, the first bifurcation is instability of symmetric length, and there's a second one to unidirectional locomotion. You wouldn't get to the second without getting to the first. Okay. And then we have a phase diagram, and so on. Now, I'm doing well on time. I think I'll finish in just a few minutes, and then we can talk a bit. Now, another thing that we started to look at in the lab is that this is a completely featureless wing. Left or right, no broken symmetries, right? But, as you know, you look at the skeletal structure of the bird, they can pitch their wings. And this pitch may be controlled passively, it may be controlled actively. Actually, Jane Wang has some nice simulations now that seem to indicate that there's a lot of passive control from the interaction of the wing with the fluid in terms of pitching. But, at any rate, what is the effect of pitching in this simple mechanical problem? And so June cooked up a very nice new wing. And there it is schematically. And so what you have actually is two flaps on the end of just a support. Again, you have the same setup where you have the pole just driving up and down. But these can rotate. These can rotate, and there's a spring-like response where their resting position is just horizontal, and then if you apply a normal force to them, then they'll rotate down, and there's a spring response, a passive spring. And it has a gear assembly in the middle, which means that they always rotate out of register. They don't both do this, because that wouldn't work very well, so it's moving around. You want them to rotate in opposite directions out of register to sit still. So there it is. There it is in water. Now it's a yet bigger tank. Tanks keep getting bigger. This is actually a medium tank. Really big one there. And here's this. Oh, I have this one up already. That's nice. There it is. Come on. Isn't being very cooperative. So there it is. Looks a bit more biological. Things have now, this is a system that has flexibility.
So just by moving up and down?
Well, of course, by moving up and down, you're exerting fluid load on it. And since you're pitching, you're rotating relative to a point of support, that gives it a rotation. So there it goes. So what is pitching?
So does this have a threshold?
Yes, yeah, it will still have a threshold. So that's another interesting point about what, so I'll come back. Let me refer you to the paper because part of the paper is half experimental and half numerical. And we investigate the threshold with the numerical stuff. And the thing is, now you have a broken symmetry, right? So let me just say, you still have a threshold, but it's softened. That's what I'm trying to say. You have a broken symmetry, but it's softened. But you can still see the onset. So you don't have something that you're just kind of smoothing out the whole thing down to Reynolds number 0. It's very, very small. There's some sort of increase with Reynolds number, and then it has an offset at about.
Can you make a lattice of these and see if you can have a macroscopic signature rating?
I'm sorry, say it again?
You need to make a lattice of these rotors.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Non-equilibrium signature.
Yeah. I like that idea. It's a little sick. I like it. How would you do that? That would be hard to do. You could do it numerically. It'd be hard to do it in an experiment. That would be a very interesting thing to do though numerically, because then that starts to get some kind of collective motion in flux.
If you think of thermal analogy, right? You could have one guy make a signature, but different guys will, rotate opposite handles. The question, do they synchronize?
I was thinking that you meant something else, but yeah, that's right. So whether you could have things kind of coupled together, maybe you get big regions of one side and regions of the other.
Well, like
phased
I
domains.
like a driven version.
Okay, so here is that same bifurcation diagram when you have just a flat featureless plate. Now, if you have this flexible plate, then what you find is that you get advantage in terms of your consequent velocity that comes from the fact that you can change your angle of orientation relative to the flows. So you can end up getting bigger speeds. But it turns out that has a limit. And as you increase the frequency of this drive for fixed amplitude, you hit a peak and you cross back across the rigid rather than flexible plate, and then you come down and you kind of apparently saturate. But more than that, turns out that there's another region, these whole things are full of bistability, just a Rhesus constant. More than that, what you find is that there's actually a region, once you get high enough in frequency, where you can have backwards flight, where you're driving by kind of the trailing edge, and it's moving forward because you're driving the trailing edge at high frequency, rather than having that move forward. And let me show you a little movie of that because it's pretty interesting. So a fish biologist found this fascinating because there are certain limits that fish swimming, how high you can drive the frequency of their swimming. He thought maybe it had something to do with the fact that they start to hit some region where they're not very well controlled. But I'm talking while you're supposed to be looking at this. So there it is. It's rotating this way, and it's being driven from the trailing end. Going forward like that. And so Saverio did a very nice and complete numerical study of this problem, using some somewhat more accurate, well-done simulations than we had previously done. And let me just show you a simulation of the backward flight in here. Now, here we don't have any markers. You have to watch the grid. So there it is initially. It's kind of sitting there in place, and then it starts to move backwards, but it's being driven right here. It's shedding this very, very peculiar weight behind it as it's going. Didn't stop it, you can see. So, Saverio had some other interesting observations having to do with the fact that in certain regimes you could see these kind of inclined weights and a not symmetric response of the body around its kind of flapping orbit going up and down. And June was able to go back into the experiments and actually find those kind of states in the experiments. So there was a very nice interplay between the numerics that Saverio was doing and the experiments. So I'm going to close there. Thanks, let's stop. But let me just say one other thing. This is an old slide, and this is also stuff Saverio worked on, other people worked on since, more enhanced experiments, but just to show you some other stuff. This is just a simple experiment from 5 years ago on hover. Okay, just because it's pretty. And take a look at the web pages. This is old. I haven't updated it. There's other things that happened since then. But this is just a simple case of where you want to look of how you might get hovering by changing the drag characteristics of the body in an oscillatory flow. So imagine I'm an organism and I live in a tidal pool. Let's just take that as an example. I live in a tidal pool and the water's kind of sloshing back and forth throughout wave action. can I change my shape in such a way in phase with the waves that I might be able to move in some direction? It's kind of a nice question, right? So I might make myself wide when the wave's moving this way so I get carried. I make myself narrow, I don't get pulled as far back, and I make myself wide and so forth. So this is something like that, where this is what we call our AC wind tunnel. So it's just a bass speaker, and so the diaphragm's moving up and down, and it's driving a column of air through a column, the test column, right there. And so this is what we call the paper bug. And so Steve came in with these paper bugs, little pieces of tissue. They're just kind of folded. And then, so they bend easily in one direction, less easily in the other. So it's like a parachute that can do this. So the bend in the paper is like a little hinge. And then we mount them on poles because that way we can look at them with the camera. And so there is a little bug, which in the absence of the airflow would sink, but in a zero mean airflow, because it changes its drag characteristics relative to the airflow, to the phase of the airflow, it can hover. And if you take the pole away, these things will just flap around and move around inside the little test section. And sometimes they'll do it for minutes. And subsequently, there's been June and Mike Restroff and Vinmu and Steve, they've been looking at what gives these things stability. Why are these little flappers stable? It turns out there's a nice picture where if they start to tilt, then when you're shedding a vortex dipole, you tend to shed a dipole that gives you a moment that pushes you back in the right place. And there's a recent couple of papers you can find on our website about that kind of dynamic. So it has, in this oscillating airflow, it has a nice kind of self-rectifying dynamics, so it's mechanically stable. Okay, so I'll stop there, and hope you had a good time. Yes.
So for the reciprocal flapper, the solid one that Jun had, does that have propulsion on it? That is to say, if I were to put like a force transducer on the arm, is there any kind of net force on it while it's, you know, on top of just the up and down motion?
On mean, I don't think there would be any I don't think there would be on, I'd have to think about that a bit. Certainly there is rotation, because it has to overcome the yield stress of the bearing.
I guess what I'm asking is, like, if you have a ship.
But it also has a gravitational, I mean, it's heavy.
Right.
This thing is heavy, so it certainly has at least that load if you put a strain gauge on it.
But like, say it's sideways. If you have, what I'm thinking is, you know, could you propel like, you know, a ship with a big, you know, all you have is this big rod going through the ship, and then a bunch of these propellers on the end, and then just push it back and forth, and somehow that propels it forward, because they start spinning. And
Interesting question. I think the answer is probably not. That's an interesting question. Maybe. You know, it could be with some perturbation. I mean, for example, it could be that if you put this thing in a closed container, I'm thinking of it as being kind of open on either end, so that it would kind of slosh fluid back, right? But if you put it in a closed container so you can absorb momentum on the end of a cylinder, and you break that symmetry, you might be able to get some thrust there. That's an interesting question. You might be able to get some thrust there. Yeah.
I'm curious why you have this thing with the two flaps that tilted instead of just using, for instance, a flexible elastic.
So the thing is, I can show you other movies. For the first round of experiments, it was just an elastic flap on the back. But it turned out to be very difficult to characterize the elastic response properties. And so this seems more controlled. You just have a simple rotational spring that you can characterize very easily. But yeah, we did exactly that. You see very similar things, but if you wanted to characterize the system, it was more difficult.
So about the previous, not this last bit, but about the flapping, well, with the rod and the two wings.
Yeah.
Is it, have we learned something about birds?
Well, yeah, that even passive pitching can give you an increase in performance.
Okay.
That's what you're doing. Yeah. Very, very simply, in a nutshell, that's what it is. And of course, biological structures naturally have compliance, so you will naturally get. So they're not going to they're not going to just keep strengthening themselves all the time, because at some point that doesn't give you advantage, it gives you disadvantage. You want to have some amount of flexibility.
But all these bifurcations that you get with this one, that it goes one way and then the other way, this is not something.
It's not, I've never seen it very different.
Okay. No, I wonder if